All right, to comment a bit more on the insurrection, we'd like to welcome former U.S. Congressman and 2020 presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke to the show. Beto, thanks so much for joining us. We've been working now for a while to have you on, mostly because you are from El Paso, bordering Ciudad Juarez. And like some of our viewers that are watching tonight, even though your heritage is not Mexican, your heart is with Mexico and your work has shown it. So would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on, Dan. I appreciate it. And I've enjoyed listening to you tonight and grateful for what you're doing to kind of bridge the differences and create some understanding between Mexico and the United States. We were just talking before the show how important that is. There's not enough of it. And you all are doing some of that. So thank you.
Thanks, Beto. And I know you've been doing a lot of things too. You've been pretty vocal in the last week about the things that have happened in the U.S. Congress, the insurrection. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on that and what was going through your mind last Wednesday when you were watching all these events take place?
You know, Dan, this really should not have been a surprise to any of us or anyone who's been watching the news or following Donald Trump or understands how complicit so many members of Congress are in his repudiation of democracy, in his rejection of the election results, and his willingness to live outside of the law and beyond the Constitution, really without any real consequences or accountability for doing so. So as awful as all the things are that Donald Trump has said and incited and done, what's even worse, I think, are the people in positions of power and public trust who've been complicit in that. And so you and I have talked about this in the past. 23 people, many of them U.S. nationals, many of them Mexican nationals, almost all of them of Mexican heritage, were killed in a Walmart in El Paso on the last Saturday before school started, doing their back to school shopping, by a man who was intent upon repelling what he called an invasion of Mexicans, an invasion of Latin Americans, an invasion of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. And that word invasion is in fact the word that Donald Trump had been using for his entire presidency and when he was a candidate for the presidency to describe people who come to this country who, as we all know, aren't invading America. When they come to America, make America better by their very presence. El Paso, Texas, right next to Ciudad Juarez, one of, if not the safest cities in the United States of America. It's 85% Mexican American. A quarter of the people who live here were born in another country. And so I would argue they've made us safe and they've contributed to the safety and security of this country. But 23 of the people in this community were killed because of the rhetoric and the incitement of this president. So people who say, holy shit, what's going on? Where did this come from? Have not been paying attention and just don't understand the cost and the consequence of allowing Donald Trump to do this. And it takes people like Ted Cruz, the junior senator from the state of Texas, who has participated in this big lie that somehow Donald Trump was the rightful winner of the election, who has stirred people to incitement and ultimately to marching on the Capitol. People like that should share not just in the blame, but in the consequences that come from this. We need to do that if we're going to repair our democracy and make sure that it works for the long term.
Absolutely. And something interesting, you mentioned so many different issues or things or events that were happening that should have, brought up the alarm bell earlier. So how do you feel about Republicans now that have finally seen the light? It's interesting when you're watching the talk shows, they're saying things like, oh, well, that wasn't the Donald Trump I knew 8 months ago. And it's just insane to hear this. And specifically, somebody you ran against in 2016, Ted Cruz, who now is continuing to make that rhetoric from before, and he is complicit in some of these actions. Am I right?
That's absolutely right. And so to your first question, look, I'm grateful that there are Republicans who are coming to their senses and are attempting at least to place the country ahead of their own political career, the future of our democracy ahead of their political party. They only number 10 in the House of Representatives out of, I guess, around 200, but that's 10 more than we had a week ago, or 2 weeks ago. But Ted Cruz is a special case because he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was really willing to work to overturn a fairly democratically, legally decided election. He was literally willing to, in effect, overthrow a democratically elected government for the sake of his own personal political gain. And that to me is one of the worst crimes you can commit against this country. Interesting, Dan, not only is he being considered for expulsion from the Senate by his colleagues, not only have two of the very biggest Texas newspapers, the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, called for his resignation, he may be placed on a no-fly list. As you know, anyone who's suspected of being a terrorist in the United States is put on a no-fly list, and you literally cannot get on an airplane and fly anywhere because Ted Cruz, in effect, incited or helped to incite that terrorist insurrection and coup attempt last Wednesday at the Capitol. They are considering placing him on a no-fly list where he would not be able to get on an airplane any longer. And as crazy as that may sound to some of your viewers, a U.S. senator, one of the most powerful men in the world, no longer being able to board an airplane, it really does fit the crime that he committed. And there has to be consequence, there has to be accountability, or we won't recover from this.
Now, do you really think that there's 2/3 of the Senate is going to act on this? I mean, there's a lot of people, not just Senator Cruz, but Senator Hawley from Missouri, also Mo Brooks, a huge vocal. And there's, as I mentioned in the past segment, talk that some of these guys were giving tours to the insurrectionists the day before to show them the Capitol grounds. Do you think there's enough energy in the Congress to make this happen?
Dan, I think to some point or to some degree, it's going to depend on what comes to light as the FBI investigates some of the allegations that you raised in your reporting earlier. Allegations that some of these members of Congress actually gave tours to the insurrectionists who the next day would attempt a coup on our government. One of whom, by the way, was found with paperwork that had, Senator Cruz's name and people in his office and maybe the phone number there written on it. We don't know what those connections are in that case, but I know that we have the capacity through our federal law enforcement to discover what those connections are. And I think once that is brought to light, then as a member of the United States Senate, with all the facts before you, I think it becomes very hard, if in fact it is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ted Cruz participated in this insurrection, in this coup attempt, that he should be expelled from the United States Senate. And I don't know that there's any love lost for Ted Cruz amongst his colleagues. He's someone who on the floor of the Senate called Mitch McConnell the Senate Majority Leader, the top ranking Republican in the country, really, after Donald Trump is gone, called him a liar on the floor of the Senate. He's pissed off and gotten on the wrong side of just about anyone he's been close to in that body and really anywhere else in the world. So I don't know that there's a lot of affection for him, and I don't know that he's going to have a champion outside of maybe Josh Hawley or Mike Lee, his maybe one friend in the Senate. So let's see, who knows? But if there isn't a consequence to this, then you will have set the precedent that this can happen without punishment, and that almost guarantees that it's going to happen again. And if you know, and I'm sure you do, if you know your history of the Roman Republic's descent into dictatorship and tyranny, it didn't just happen from Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It was the violation of norms that went unpunished for decades, ultimately giving that opening to Caesar. If you look at the history of the Weimar Republic after the First World War in Germany, the big lie that Jews had stabbed Germany in the back and had lost Germany the war, Hitler was able to play upon that big lie and further that big lie. And others who were complicit in his and the Nazis' rise to power, the beer hall push, that almost comedic attempt to implement a coup in Germany led by Adolf Hitler, that was stopped. It was 15 years after that he ultimately rose to ultimate power in Germany. What's going to happen 15 years from our version of the beer hall push with the goofball with the Viking helmet and all these other guys who, once they stormed the Capitol, didn't know what to do with themselves and were taking pictures of themselves. Some of them, others with zip ties and guns,
Right.
you know, going to hunt down members of Congress potentially to kill them. What's going to happen 15 years from now if this is not aggressively put down, and if everyone involved, including members of Congress, including U.S. senators, does not pay the full price for their participation? That's the question before the people of America right now.
Absolutely. And it's going to be interesting in the next couple of weeks to really hear deep down about what the intentions of these people were, if they were coordinating the attacks, if somebody behind the scenes was doing it, and what they were really set out to do, because it seems like we don't really understand that fully yet. So it's really interesting. I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk more about the election, because in the last couple of weeks when you're coming on the show, I've been explaining to a lot of my Mexican friends about your incredible rise in Texas in 2006 and 2018 to running for Senate and really making a dent in this red Texas and almost winning against Ted Cruz. But in 2020, it was a little bit more a different story. All the polls thought that Texas was going to go blue. And of course, in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, in a 10-year push, was able to switch Georgia blue. And it was really incredible. What happened in Texas? One of the things is that from where I lived for a long time, the Rio Grande Valley in Roma, Texas, and always a big shout out for the beautiful Roma. People went a lot more for Trump in 2020 that they did in 2016, voting against their, I guess some values. And what was surprising was that people are saying that the low turnout in the Rio Grande Valley prevented Texas from turning blue. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's still a lot of work for us to do in Texas. So we are a state where every major policy issue comes to a head. So if it's COVID, I mean, here in El Paso, so many people have died of COVID so quickly that, you know, there are more than 10 mobile morgues set up, and they had to call in the National Guard to move the dead bodies. And it is, as you know, it is like that in the Rio Grande Valley and in South Texas as well. So if it's COVID, if it's the recession and the job losses that followed, if it is gun violence, if it is immigration, if it's kids in cages, if it is, you name it, it's happening in Texas, and probably happening on a scale unmatched by any other state. And yet, Texas ranks 46th in the country in voter turnout, 46th out of 50, which is embarrassing, but explicable. I mean, you can explain this because you have 140 plus years of voter suppression and voter intimidation aimed at Black voters, at Mexican American voters, at Latino voters, at voters in communities of color. And it's been devastatingly effective. And you look at the voter turnout in El Paso County, 53%. In Webb County, where Laredo is, 50%. Go further down in the valley, and you're seeing similar numbers. And so I'd say this, Dan, as a state, we did better than we have in any presidential cycle in a very long time in terms of the margin by which the Democratic nominee lost. And we held on to state rep seats that we picked up in 2018, which is a big year for Democrats in Texas. And I will tell you, Mexican American voters had a lot to do with those successes. And a lot has been said and written about what happened in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. We don't have all the data and information yet. And I really would warn anyone against saying that somehow Latinos or Mexican Americans, turned against Joe Biden or turned out for Donald Trump. And until we know the full story, we don't know that that's the case. And what we do know is that traditionally, historically, and in this election at large across the state of Texas, Mexican Americans and Latinos really did well for Democratic candidates. And where we have a challenge, as you can imagine, is in more of the Anglo parts of the state that tend to overwhelmingly vote for Republicans. So that self-interest argument, I think, can extend across the state. So here's where I think we can do a better job we should be working with these communities like mine here in El Paso, in the same way that Stacey Abrams was working in Georgia, where the effort to persuade a voter is not to persuade them to vote for Democrats, but to persuade them to vote at all, and to somehow connect their vote with the difference that they want to see in their lives. And I would credit Stacey Abrams and the New Georgia Project and many of those other grassroots partners in that state for doing that work over the last 10 years.
Right.
That's work that many of us have been doing in Texas for some time now. And it's work that I want to continue doing along with many others in 2021 and beyond. I think that's the way over the long term we get it done. One last thing is, remember, Texas is a state of 30 million people. And so Georgia is a fraction of the size. We have a much bigger state, 254 counties, a lot more people to engage, register, and work with. So it's going to take a little while, but it's work worth doing, and it's work that will pay off over time.
Right, absolutely. And it seems like those issues in those counties on the border were very localized. For example, in Zapata County about the oil and that they were going to take away the oil. In some other counties about the Democratic machine institution for a long time, we're letting them down, or some institutional racism amongst Mexican Americans for Mexicans, for First Nation Mexicans that are coming in. And these are really important issues. Beto, we're running out of time, but I have two important questions for you left. The first one is, I was a little disappointed that when you finished your presidential bid that you didn't throw your hat in the ring to try again in the Senate race. Do you think if you would have ran, that maybe because you're a border person, you could have increased that turnout and got people to go to the polls and maybe now be the U.S. Senator from Texas?
I don't know, but it really wasn't a hard decision for me to make. On the one hand, we had just run for 2 years, just an extraordinary campaign for Senate, and as you know, and I say this too often, but we went to every one of the 254 counties, and that meant that I was on the road just about every day of my life for 2 years, away from my family, and just all of us working our hearts out. And right after that, we then did the same thing across the country for a year. And so just to be honest with you, I was just dead tired. I just was hard for me to even contemplate doing that. And then here's the other thing, probably more important, and that is that there were a number of extraordinary candidates running for the Democratic nomination to run for Senate against Cornyn. And those included candidates, Black women, Latinas, Black men, white men. I mean, an incredibly diverse, representative field of candidates. And it did not in any way feel right to me to belatedly, come in at the 11th hour and say, all right, guys, you've just done everything you could to compete over the last year. I'm going to waltz in and try to wrap this up right before your eyes. That felt very wrong to me. And so anyhow, in hindsight, I'm glad that I didn't do that. But over the last year, we started an organization called Powered by People, and I really do think contributed very meaningful work on registering voters, on engaging with voters, and on supporting all the candidates up and down the ballot who were running in the state of Texas. And it was very fulfilling. And Dan, it was the first time in my life for the last 15 years at least that I have not held an office or have not been campaigning for an office. And I was a volunteer like everybody else. And that's great work if you can get it. And so I'm glad I got a chance to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, Beto. And it shows the true heart and soul that you have. And I know that's why a lot of people riled behind you in Texas and then nationally during Texas and after Texas. And I want to finish up with this. I wanted to talk to you about this story. And hopefully one day you can come back on the show when there's no insurrections and crazy things going on in the world to talk more about the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, because this is really what this show is about bringing people together and a better understanding of both sides. There's a touching story that you shared with a group last year about during COVID times, you were working for for food bank and making sure that people in El Paso had food, but they were so overwhelmed by it that Mexico pitched in. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, at the start of the pandemic, which was also the start of the worst recession since the Great Depression, um, we had lines at our food bank that stretched, 2, 3 miles long. And so, if you think about it, these are folks who, in their cars are waiting for hours, moving, a little bit at a time, maybe getting in line at 2 or 3 in the morning to pick up a box of food that is supposed to sustain them and their families for a week. And who the hell knows what's going to be in your box of food? Maybe a big can of beans, maybe some rice, maybe some cabbage, maybe some cookies, maybe some canned peaches, or maybe none of that stuff. And it's whatever they could find that was available, very often donated by local grocery stores or what the food bank had resources to purchase. And that's just a real tough place for those families to be in. And we were volunteering at the food bank, and the director said, "Look, we cannot get rice, we cannot get beans. These are obviously staples of the diet here in El Paso, Texas, and we've tried everywhere in the U.S., but we're competing against food banks in Chicago, in Houston, in LA, and they have more money and more resources, and we can't bid against them. And what can you do?" And I reached out to a gentleman, Alvaro Bustillos, in Ciudad Juarez, who essentially runs the economic development team there. And I'd met him before, and just a wonderful man. And as we were discussing earlier, if you live in El Paso or you live in Juarez, you really live in both communities. And so, understanding that relationship, I said, there have got to be some beans and there've got to be some rice in Juarez or in Chihuahua or in Mexico. Can you help me out? And I called him in the evening, and that same evening, he connected me with two distributors out of the state of Chihuahua who felt like they could meet the needs of the local food bank. And we were able to connect them with the El Paso Food Bank, and they were able to work on something. And like you said, I think very often the attitude in America, at least for those who don't understand Mexico or relationship with Mexico and don't live on the border, is that Mexico is the source of immigrants or drugs or problems or crime, all the stupid shit that Donald Trump has been saying, which, by the way, people have been saying for forever, and he's just said it louder than anybody else. But this story shows us that it's really a reciprocal relationship, and that Mexico contributes very, very much to the success of the United States. Obviously, in the people who choose to come to the United States from Mexico, who are, every success story that I can think of in El Paso is connected to Mexico, but also in these acts of kindness and generosity that don't often get reported or talked about. And there are many times in El Paso's history where we've had a challenge or disaster or been in trouble, and this is only the most recent one, where the people of Ciudad Juarez have come forward and offered their assistance. So I agree with you. It's a touching story to me, and it represents the beauty of the binational relationship. And it's those kinds of stories we should be telling. And when anyone brings up the lies that those like Donald Trump will try to scare us with about the border.
Absolutely. Definitely. Beto, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show here today. Hope you come down to Mexico City soon. Hope you run for Senate and beat Ted Cruz in a couple of years, or whatever you can do, because I know that you're a friend of Mexico, and especially the large American community, 1 million people that live here in Mexico. It's great to have an advocate for Mexico on the other side of the border that has been very active in the political community, and to keep on doing what you're doing over there in Texas. Thank you so much, Beto, for being on the show.
Thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
All right, Beto O'Rourke, former U.S. Congressman. Thanks so much for joining us.